test.
The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will now come to order. You notice that we are starting just a couple of minutes late. We understand that the environment hearing downstairs started a couple of minutes late, and we're trying to accommodate the chairman of the full committee and the ranking member of the full committee to get up here for their opening statements. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone, and to our witnesses, thank you for being here and welcome. We're here to talk about prioritization, not just paid prioritization, all prioritization online. Despite what some of my colleagues sometimes seem to think, prioritization is not a dirty word. The Internet, in fact, is based on it. In the net neutrality conversation, there is a common misconception that the Internet is one big highway where all the cars travel at the same speed and we cannot allow for any fast lanes to exist without causing a big traffic jam for everybody else. It is something like the picture that we're going to put up on the screen. It ran into a jam. Yes, we're in need of some prioritization here. Okay. No, that's the wrong picture. Let's see if we can. Okay. Our witnesses today know that this couldn't be further from the truth, and the next picture we're going to put up, in fact, is probably a lot closer to reality, but it is still an oversimplified idea of the Internet. Different connections, agreements, prioritization, depending on the needs. And the amazing new capabilities that we will experience on next-generation networks will be realized not only through innovation in the chips and the servers and the infrastructure, but also through even more efficient and effective prioritization. I would also point out that in real life, all sorts of interactions are prioritized every day. Many of you sitting in the room right now paid a line sitter to get priority access to this hearing. In fact, it is commonplace for the government itself to offer priority access to services. If you've ever used priority mail, you know this to be the case. And what about TSA PreCheck? It just might have saved you time as you travel today. If you define paid prioritization as simply the act of paying to get your own content in front of the consumer faster, prioritized ads or sponsored content are the basis of many business models online, as many of our members pointed out during the Facebook hearing last week. Prioritization is sometimes crucial from a public policy standpoint. Just as we all want the ambulance and the fire truck to be prioritized over the rest of the traffic on the highway, there is a need for voice packets to be prioritized over data packets to make sure that your 911 calls get through first. And there are lots of other examples where we can all agree that certain data and certain applications should be prioritized on the network. One of our witnesses is pioneering a technology to provide real-time audio support to the visually impaired, describing the surroundings and the nonverbal interactions taking place around the user. Other examples that our witnesses will discuss today include telemedicine and autonomous vehicles. Prioritization of data on the network is not unique or uniquely harmful. It may be an uphill climb, but what we are trying to do with this hearing is to leave aside the simplistic, fast lane talking points and kick off a more realistic discussion on the subject. My net neutrality bill left out the old language banning all paid prioritization because I believe that we need a more nuanced approach and a more thorough and thoughtful discussion. For the government to consider a ban on any prioritization on the internet, paid or unpaid, we need a better understanding of what specific harmful conduct we are trying to address and a better understanding of how to leave the door open for the beneficial prioritization that's necessary to keep the internet as we know it working and to bring even more benefits to consumers. Now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Doyle, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing before us. I'd like to, in particular, thank Matt Wood, a proud Pittsburgher, for being here today. This subcommittee is once again discussing net neutrality and the fallout from Chairman Pai's repeal of the 2015 Open Internet Order. This short-sighted act has created an uncertain landscape where innovators and entrepreneurs trying to develop new services, applications, and devices can be taxed, tolled, or blocked at any time by an ISP. Prioritization practices that were once required to meet the standard of reasonable network management as judged by federal experts in network engineering, telecommunications, and competition policy at the FCC will now be determined by an ISP's bottom line. As I've talked to companies large and small that developed and deployed new applications in the wake of the 2015 net neutrality rules, their message was clear, that the certainty created by the rules was stoking investment and giving certainty to investors, and that consumers were benefiting from these new offerings. A number of companies I talked with were working to deploy services that directly competed with ISP's own offering at lower prices, bringing what we can all agree is a much-needed competition to a stagnant marketplace. I'm deeply concerned that as we move forward in a world without the open internet rules, ISPs will once again act in anti-competitive ways intended to tamp down competition and consolidate their hold over their consumers. We've already seen ISPs zero-rate data from their own services and their affiliates while forcing users to either limit usage on competing apps or pay costly overage fees. If we look at the history of the internet before net neutrality, we find a number of instances where ISPs used their market position to stifle innovation and prevent competitors from bringing new products to market, all while coming to Congress and the government arguing that they were only thinking about the consumer. Today, it seems we're adding another chapter to that book. Today, we're talking about the prioritization of the internet content. If the testimony of a number of our witnesses is to be believed, paid prioritization can bring great benefits to the internet. They claim that the coming flood of data can only be dealt with by prioritizing it and creating incentives and opportunities for websites and edge providers to pay to get their packets to consumers before their competitors. Well, frankly, I don't believe it. We've heard these arguments before. The truth is, giving ISPs the ability to play gatekeeper only benefits the ISPs and their shareholders, and it significantly hurts innovators and consumers. More than that, it fundamentally undercuts the level playing field and open marketplace that defines the internet economy. Now, I have a bill that has 160 co-sponsors in the House with companion legislation with bipartisan support in the Senate to fix this mess. Our CRA would reinstate the 2015 open internet rules and restore the FCC to its expert oversight role over ISP network practices. When you look at the polling on this issue, these rules have overwhelmingly bipartisan support with a vast majority of Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and I hope to work with my friends on the other side of the aisle to make this bill bipartisan as well. And Madam Chair, I'd also like to raise a process issue leading up to today's hearing. Mr. Bennett, who was first to submit his testimony, amended his submission yesterday afternoon in meaningful ways. I'm concerned that many of the changes to Mr. Bennett's written submission were of a substantive and factual nature, and that is of great concern to us. I don't believe the committee should get into the practice of allowing such last-minute changes. When we have witnesses do this, the committee process breaks down, and it leads to many of us just questioning whether the testimony will be credible. I'd also like to note that baseball season is starting here in Congress. I had my team out on the field for the first time today, and like baseball, these markets cannot function without clear rules and a ref to call balls and strikes. The word is that ISPs want us to live in one where there is no referee and where there are no rules. The game only ends when the other team and all the fans go home because they're just sick of watching one team playing by their own rules. I don't want to live in that world, and neither do the American people. Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to have the following documents into the record. Letters from Encompass, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the National Association of Realtors, and the Center for Connected Health Policy.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. Thank you all for being here. We appreciate your expert testimony as we try to wade into this issue and get to the facts. This subcommittee in particular has long led the way in exercising oversight over the Internet. As we'll hear today, the Internet looks nothing like it did when it was first fully commercialized back in 1995. Back then, networks were in their nascent stage, and network management presented a different set of problems. But today, with users sending over 100 exabytes of data per month, networks have had to continually adapt to manage congestion and will need to do so even more adeptly and efficiently in the future. The development of these networks and their ability to handle the ever-growing traffic demands users place on them is truly an innovative feat, and not one that consumers often think about, because when you turn on your computer or unlock your phone, the network, the Internet, just works. Because it appears so simple, it's easy for consumers to think about the Internet connection as being managed by their ISP, their Internet service provider, from one end to the other. And for years, consumers were told the Internet was an information superhighway, giving the false impression that all Internet traffic is moving the same direction on an equal plane at the same time. We even use the word traffic to describe the movement of information and data across the Internet, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. The Internet is not a highway where there can be so-called fast and slow lanes. The Internet is actually a network of networks with many layers managing the data that flows across it. There are application layers that establish the connection and encrypt data. There is the transport layer that prepares data for transport. And there's the network layer, which identifies the packet routing sequence. Within these layers, there are many different players aside from your ISP involved in managing traffic: devices, software, Wi-Fi routers, and content delivery networks, or CDNs, can all load, manage, and relay traffic in different ways. We'll hear from our witnesses today a more in-depth explanation of how the Internet actually works, not just talking points, and the role prioritization plays in operating networks. But in a basic sense, prioritization has nothing to do with traffic speed. Rather, it's putting certain bits over others to ensure that all packets arrive to their destination on time. A complete ban on prioritization would not permit this and would not allow some services and applications to operate smoothly. In other words, prioritization currently exists across the Internet architecture and is necessary to ensure the Internet functions properly. It's also worth noting that while we've heard a lot from our friends at the edge providers about how prioritization is bad for business, those operating at the edge pay to prioritize traffic every day through the use of various interconnection agreements, including CDNs. In order to facilitate high-demand applications like video streaming, many of the most popular content providers don't send data over the public Internet. Rather, they directly interconnect with a CDN, allowing the edge provider's traffic to be prioritized to provide a better user experience. It's estimated that by 2021, CDNs will carry 71% of global Internet traffic. Today is not the first time this committee has considered how to best legislate the issue of prioritization. I released draft legislation last Congress that would establish rules of the road to ensure the Internet remains open to all. Similarly, Chairman Blackburn introduced her Open Internet Preservation Act at the end of last year. Rather than waste our efforts on partisan legislation like the CRA, we hope our colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join our effort to develop legislation that will provide lasting solutions to some of the outstanding questions regarding Internet traffic management. What exactly do we mean, and what harms are we trying to address in restricting Internet prioritization, whether paid or unpaid, whether the content's affiliated or not? So I agree with Chairman Blackburn that in order to move forward toward a long overdue legislative solution, we need to be able to have this conversation in a nuanced, in-depth manner and figure out the common ground. So I look forward to hearing from all the witnesses. I would just tell you we have another hearing going on downstairs, so a lot of members have to bounce back and forth. But we do have your prepared testimony, and we appreciate your participation in this very important discussion about the future of the Internet. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Pallone, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Internet is a powerful engine of economic growth and a potent platform for free speech. With a working broadband connection, anyone can work from home, sell their own products online, and connect with companies a world away. And in the past few years, we've seen how the Internet can help everyday people launch a worldwide political movement. But the power of the Internet is rooted in the principles of net neutrality. These principles are simple and well understood. Broadband companies cannot pick Internet winners and losers by blocking or slowing down content or charging extra for fast lanes. It's a question of fairness, and there are no loopholes. Until the Trump administration took over the FCC, even the broadband providers themselves supported these principles, including a flat ban on fast lanes. The largest providers told us time and again that they agreed that paid prioritization should be prohibited. They said that they had no intention of charging anyone extra for faster speeds. But recently, those voices have gone silent, and that silence presents a real threat to small businesses and speech online. Where there was once agreement on a prohibition on fast lanes, some now want to add loopholes to net neutrality. The reasoning is convoluted and confusing. They argue that somehow allowing broadband providers to charge small companies extra for Internet fast lanes is good for small business. But that makes no sense, and no one's buying it. Small businesses oppose having to pay extra for fast lanes. So do telemedicine companies, disabled veterans groups, self-driving car companies, churches, nonprofits, and the list goes on. Net neutrality advocates have spoken loud and clear. We want everyone to have a faster Internet, not just the chosen few who can afford to pay extra. And that's why Democrats on this committee introduced the Lift America Act to bring faster broadband to everyone. The only ones who want broadband providers to charge money for fast lanes are the broadband providers. And despite these latest attempts to muddy the water and create confusion, banning paid prioritization is not a new issue. The FCC solved this problem when it passed net neutrality in 2015. At that time, the FCC correctly banned these fast lanes with the exception of certain specialized services like healthcare. The FCC got it right in 2015, and the Trump FCC got it wrong when it killed net neutrality last year. And that's why I support the legislation introduced by Ranking Member Doyle that would restore the well-crafted and balanced 2015 protections. And I encourage any of my colleagues who support real net neutrality to sign on to Ranking Member Doyle's CRA as well. The CRA is the best way to put net neutrality back in place and support small businesses. And I'd like to yield the remaining time to Ms. Eshu.
I thank our ranking member, and good morning, everyone, and to the witnesses, welcome and thank you for being here. We're now a decade into the fight to protect net neutrality, and throughout that time, there have been many arguments from those who oppose it, that it will kill jobs, it would harm investment, or hurt the free press. All of these have been refuted, each in turn. This is actually, I think, a very simple issue. It's about fairness and equal access to an essential resource, the Internet. The 2015 Open Internet Order created the strongest, most reliable rules to protect that level playing field for innovation. The courts and the FCC both acknowledged that net neutrality was critical to the virtuous cycle that has enabled the Internet to act as a tool of growth, of innovation, of investment, and of free expression. That same FCC found that paid prioritization is inherently harmful to that fruitful cycle that fuels education, jobs, and our economy. Yet now we have the same companies who proclaim in full-page newspaper ads that they support net neutrality. But they're pushing for an exception for prioritization. This is about money. This is about money. We should just all acknowledge that and have a debate about it. But it's all about money. We may be a decade down the road, but it's about the same thing that it always has been about, and that is who controls the on-ramps to the internet, being able to pick winners or losers. And that's based on pay to play. It is about money. I don't blame companies for wanting to make money. That's what they're in the business to do. But we have an obligation to the public. I think that's what this debate is about. So I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and I think everyone knows exactly where I stand on this. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Pallone yields back. And this concludes our member opening statements. I will remind the committee that each member's opening statement will be made a part of the permanent record for the committee. We thank our witnesses for being here today, and you all are going to have the opportunity to give your opening statements, followed by a round of questions from our members. Our panel today, Mr. Richard Bennett, founder of High Tech Forum, Mr. Peter Risave, am I saying that properly? Risave, president of Risave Research, Mr. Paul Schrader, director of Public Policy and Strategic Alliances at IRA Tech Corporation, and Matt Wood, policy director at Free Press. We appreciate each of you for being here today and for providing your testimony. Mr. Bennett, we begin with you. Please, each one of you, as you speak, turn your microphones on. And Mr. Bennett, you are recognized for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Blackburn, and hello to Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Doyle, and Ranking Member Pallone, and members of the committee, especially Ms. Eshu, whose district I used to live in, and who gave me a really hard time the first time I testified before this committee, but I probably deserved it. Prioritization has been part of the Internet's design from the beginning, in that there's a type of service field in the Internet Protocol header, and it's been refined through integrated services, a standard design in the 1990s, then differentiated services. So it's not by itself anything controversial about prioritization. And I think it's fair to say that while it was controversial for a time, it's come to be recognized. There's a consensus sort of support that done correctly, prioritization is beneficial to applications. So we've reached this consensus, I think, after about 15 years of debate around what we call net neutrality now, that it's legitimate for ISPs, CDNs, transit networks, and purpose-built networks like WebEx to accelerate time-sensitive traffic. If you go back to the original paper that Tim Wu wrote on net neutrality, he points out that the Internet's inherently biased against real-time applications as a class, and biased in favor of content applications. And I think if we're not careful about how we treat paid prioritization, we can make that bias worse, and that's something we should try to avoid. I think we also, as far going back to the consensus question, we also believe that competition is a good thing. We want tech policies that increase that. So prioritization and the related technologies, such as resource reservation, traffic shaping, and dynamic path selection, have not only become commonplace, but I think they're widely regarded as essential to certainly the real-time applications part of the Internet. And this is good, because no matter how much capacity networks have, we can also always make their operation more efficient if we apply optimization techniques. And there are certain problems that we solve with optimization that you can't really build your way out of simply by throwing more capacity at the problem. It's like trying to solve, throwing money at problems that you don't really understand. And I think we appreciate that prioritization mechanisms such as the IEEE 802.11e standard that I helped design are beneficial to real-time applications such as voice in the same way that LTE bearers are. The fact that one is provided free on a closed enterprise network and the other is sold as part of a bundle that includes carrier-grade voice, I think doesn't really impact on their utility. These are useful things. We found that by prioritizing voice and Wi-Fi, we get 4 times as many voice calls through a Wi-Fi network. But it's hard to explain the continual increases in broadband speeds we've seen in the U.S. over the last 10 years. Speed improves 35% per year without giving some credit to the expectation of profit. The fact that web speeds have stagnated over this same period, even declining in 2016, suggests something is wrong with the web's financial model, and I think the committee explored that last week. But leaving the consumer broadband market questions aside, paid prioritization, internet optimization is very important to enterprises that have to connect, say, branch offices to headquarters. The traditional way to do that was to lease, and in some cases still is widely done. People lease business data services lines like a T1 for $300 a month that only gives you 1.5 megabits per second. But with prioritization, you could actually, with the proper management, you could actually use a public common internet connection to connect the branch office to the headquarters. And so now you're getting 50 to 250 megabits per second for less than $100 a month. But this only works. You can only have that cost savings if someone is prioritizing the traffic on that pipe. So let's bear in mind that while there are fees for these things, the alternatives can also be quite costly. So yeah, it's important, I think, to recognize the internet is no longer just a research network. The internet is the network. It's replaced all the other I mean, not quite completely, but in the next few years, all the other networks are going to be subsumed by the internet. So we can't apply the sort of old, like, research network standards to the internet. We have to recognize that the fundamental requirement is that it serves all the needs of all the use cases of all the people who connect to it. And I think whatever it takes to do that is fine, given the proper oversight.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Survey. There we go.
Chairman Blackburn, is this on? Ranking Member Doyle and other distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing. I am president of Versavi Research, an analyst in the wireless industry with more than 25 years of experience. When I started, the hot new wireless technology was 1G. I'm an expert in wireless technology. I've worked with many dozens of firms and have published more than 175 reports and articles. My testimony is on 5G. 5G will start to be deployed as early as this year, end of this year, and will become the dominant wireless technology through the 2020s. It is being designed and developed by organizations, individuals from all over the world, and will employ sophisticated mechanisms to handle different kinds of traffic flows. This is critical because 5G is being designed to address a much wider range of use cases than prior generations of technology. Many of the applications envisioned for 5G are of a control nature, and that means they need minimal delay and high reliability. These types of applications, whether it's controlling drones in real time, or robots, or sending emergency messages to autonomous vehicles, will depend on traffic prioritization. 5G's reliance on traffic prioritization should not be viewed as problematic for internet traffic that will not be prioritized. Traffic differentiation and prioritization is not a zero-sum game. You can prioritize certain traffic flows without adversely affecting other users' applications. The goal in managing network traffic is to maximize the quality of experience across the entire subscriber base. 5G needs QoS management not only for traffic prioritization to support mission-critical applications, but also enable a fundamental architectural component called network slicing. Again, this is being designed and developed for cellular operators to deploy on a global basis. Network slicing, implemented through virtualization, will allow an operator to provide different services with different performance characteristics, customized for the specific use cases involved, such as those needing low latency, enhanced reliability. Even with new spectrum and expected peak throughputs that will exceed a gigabit per second, 5G networks will still have to manage latency, reliability, massive numbers of connections, and a mix of stationary and mobile users. Capacity alone is not the solution. The United States has assumed global leadership in 4G. It enjoys deep LTE 4G penetration, leading smartphone platforms, and a vibrant application ecosystem. But globally, countries and companies are investing in and concentrating on what will come next with 5G. Constraining 5G with rules that restrict traffic management necessary for the traffic flows anticipated with 5G applications could threaten U.S. leadership in mobile technology and deployment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Schrader, you are recognized for 5 minutes, and I will give you a warning at 30 seconds. How's that?
Thank you very much. Good morning. I think the microphone is on. Thank you, Chairman Blackburn, members of the subcommittee. Very pleased to be with you this morning. My name is Paul Schrader, and I am here on behalf of IRA, a San Diego-based technology company. Our groundbreaking service provides instant access to visual information for people who are blind or visually impaired. As such, our service relies on the transmission of streaming video from the network edge through mobile up to the internet without interruption at high speeds to ensure ultra-low latency connection between the blind individual and the remotely located sighted assistant who is providing information based on the video feed. We leverage mobile communications as well as innovative technologies, such as the smart glasses that I'm wearing. And yes, there is a camera in the middle of these glasses that is connected to an agent as we speak. We also use GPS and other sensors, augmented reality, and are incorporating machine learning. Besides the technology, IRA's success really depends on our human agents. They are highly trained, they are paid, they are held to a confidentiality requirement, and they do undergo background checks before they serve as an agent. Our customers, we call them explorers, pay for access to a fixed number of minutes per month. We are, though, working with agencies such as the Department of Veterans Affairs to ensure that blinded veterans have access to this critical service. I also want to note that Congressman Peters and Congressman Rutherford have been very helpful in leading a bipartisan effort to ensure that the VA is paying attention to these new technologies. This week, IRA has designated the congressional office buildings as free IRA zones. This was a choice we made because there is a large group of individuals who are blind visiting this week, and we know that this will help them navigate the halls of Congress more effectively. We encourage others to do this, and I do want to note for Chairman Blackburn, your home state airport of Memphis was the first one to join the IRA airport network, paying for the minutes of IRA users at Memphis Airport in order to get around the airports more effectively. Yesterday, 2 of our IRA explorers ran the Boston Marathon using IRA. Now, most of us, blind or sighted, probably aren't going to run a marathon, but the test of a low latency available network was put to the test at the marathon, and many of us will have opportunities to test that in other environments. For example, hustling through an airport trying to find the gate for our airplane, checking out bus signs in a crowded bus garage to figure out the one that we need, quickly looking at a chart or slide in a meeting or a classroom, or maybe a congressional hearing, in order to get the information from that slide as a person who's blind. putting information into these kiosks that are popping up everywhere in order to order or confirm a reservation. And of course, reading a medication label to ensure that we are actually taking the right medication. For those of us who are blind or visually impaired using IRA, we need instant access to this information. We need a network that is reliable and a network that has low latency because our video is able to stream upward from the mobile edge. We're particularly pleased to note our partner AT&T has offered dynamic traffic management to IRA to ensure that our users have the low latency network and reliable connectivity that they need and our agents need as well. I'm pleased to say this morning I am joined by an agent. Amy, are you there?
I am. Good morning, Paul.
We'll put the speaker by the phone. You want to do a very quick description of the room, please?
Absolutely. So I see 3 rows of desks and that have white wood on the bottom of them and then a darker mahogany top of the desk, and they are separated by an aisle in the middle, and the very back of the room has a single panel of speakers. I see the chairwoman is in the very middle of the room. A gentleman to her left is waving at me. There are 2 American flags that are flanking the center.
30
window.
seconds.
There's 3 windows directly across from you at the back.
I'm going to have you hold up, and we'll come back to you if there's a question for the agent. We are investing in artificial intelligence as well so that we can bring automation to our service. And we are, of course, looking forward to the emergence of 5G, which will help our low latency network and service be even stronger. Finally, I just want to say we encourage policymakers to support policies and programs that will promote and expand reliable access to visual information, such as what IRA is providing as a right to those of us who are blind or visually impaired. Thank you.
Gentleman yells back. Mr. Wood, 5 minutes.
Chairman Blackburn and Ranking Member Doyle and members of the subcommittee, thank you for having me here today to testify. Free Press is a nonpartisan nonprofit with 1.4 million members, and we were founded 15 years ago to elevate people's voices in policy decisions that shape our media. Today, we believe that achieving racial justice and social justice require equitable access to technology and information. That's why we work on net neutrality. We supported the strong rules recently and wrongly repealed by the FCC, and we support Congressman Doyle's resolution to restore them. And we are not alone. Hundreds of members have co-sponsored that resolution in the House and Senate. Thousands of businesses and organizations and state and local officials support it too. Millions of people have made their voices heard, first at the FCC and then in these halls, opposing that repeal and calling on you to pass the CRA. That's not surprising because, as Mr. Doyle noted, poll after poll shows that net neutrality rules enjoy tremendous popular support across party lines. One poll last summer showed that 72% of Republicans supported the 2015 rules. Another taken before the FCC's December vote found that 83% of all respondents opposed that repeal. Free Press supports restoring the entire 2015 order because we need more than 3 bright lines to preserve the open internet. We need FCC authority to prevent new forms of discrimination and also to address digital divides, protect privacy, and promote competition. Yet some people claim that paid prioritization bans are harmful, and they say that ISPs should be able to charge new kinds of fees and that internet users and businesses would benefit from such new charges. They also say this would help with last-mile congestion without explaining its scope or accounting for the ways that networks already deal with that. As a general matter, prioritizing rather than building capacity to solve any last-mile congestion over a sustained period would let ISPs profit from artificial scarcity. It would let them charge more to get through the bottleneck rather than building a bigger path. So paid prioritization is not just a solution in search of a problem, it's a toll booth in search of a traffic jam. ISP's own data shows that under Title II, both broadband investment and deployment speeds increased markedly in rural and urban areas alike. Despite that evidence, some still insist that strong rules made ISPs invest too little. Now, funnily enough, we're told that the rules may make ISPs invest too much by requiring them to build, quote, excess capacity instead of prioritizing their way out of congestion. Whatever the investment incentives of the paid prioritization ban, discarding this rule would cause a radical change to the internet. That ban prohibited ISPs favoring traffic only in exchange for payment from a third party or to benefit an ISP's affiliates, such as video or voice offers. In other words, it did not ban the kinds of user-directed and application-driven traffic management techniques praised by others here today. Those kinds of practices leave ISPs' customers in control when it comes to choosing how to use their connections. And those customers already can and do choose to buy faster speed tiers when they so desire. They could even buy what's called a quality of service tier to use on applications of their choosing and at times of their own choosing. Long-standing network protocols also can and do make these kinds of choices neutrally. ISPs don't need to inspect our internet traffic as they transmit it or to second-guess how to treat it. The paid priority rule banned none of these network management techniques. It applied only if the ISP tried to make a content provider pay extra just to reach broadband customers or just to cut in line ahead of other traffic. People already pay for their connections. The websites and apps they visit should not suddenly be asked to do so too. So if I visit marciablackburn.com or mikedoyleforcongress.com on my home connection, those websites don't have to pay my ISP to reach me. Let me be clear, I'm not here to defend big edge providers from such payments. I represent internet users. But letting gatekeeper ISPs impose new tolls would distort the choices users have, and ISPs undoubtedly would get together with those largest edge providers to set the terms and prices for any such advantages. It would be inefficient for every edge provider to have to strike such deals with every ISP in the country, and signing up for such deals means they'd be double charged for data that ISP subscribers already paid to receive. Academics can speculate that in a different kind of access market, such new fees might reduce subscriber costs. They still do not explain why ISPs facing so little competition would have any incentive to lower their retail prices. So when ISP executives talk about paid prioritization, they don't describe it as a way to reduce revenues or to replace the source for those revenues. They talk about it as a chance to increase their revenues. That's why the notion that new ISP fees might benefit internet users and reduce their prices brings to mind a joke I've heard on several occasions. But with all due respect to the originator of that joke, I think that the most terrifying words in the language may be, I'm from the cable company and I'm here to save you money. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yells back. This concludes the testimony from our witnesses. We thank you for that, and we will now move to our questions and answers. I'll begin and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bennett, I want to come to you first. I want to discuss a tweet from Matthew Prince, the CEO of Cloudflare, from last November. This exchange occurred on the day the FCC made its Restoring Internet Freedom order available to the public. Someone tweeted a wish that a tech billionaire would buy out the local ISP where Chairman Pai lives and throttle his internet access in retaliation for reversing the previous commission's order. Matthew Prince tweeted in reply, "I could do this in a different but equally effective way." He went on to say he had sent a note to his general counsel to see if Cloudflare could throttle Pai's access without breaking any laws. This tweet certainly raises a number of questions, and in fact, it gave us the idea for this hearing. Was Matthew Prince right? And if so, how could he have done this?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Blackburn. I think I remember that exchange. I got involved in it myself, actually. The reason that, and I think what it illustrates is how the construction of the internet, the structure, the architecture has changed since the sort of founding days, and even really since Tim Wu came up with the idea for net neutrality. So instead of it being a system that consists of users attached, with their computers and mobile devices to an infrastructure that's provided only by internet service providers, the infrastructure is actually, there's a lot going on in the infrastructure today that didn't used to be there in the very beginning. And content delivery networks have been mentioned several times, and that's one example. It's technically, content delivery networks are edge services, but it turns out that all parts of the edge are not equal. So if you put a content delivery network on a portion of the edge close to the end user, then by that very act of simply locating the data there, you've moved the data to the head of a line that other suppliers of information that could be, say, on an average of half a nation away would have to join at the back. CDNs put you at the front. So Cloudflare has a number of, they're actually quite innovative products the company has. So it's sort of it's hard to, I'm not completely a fan, but some of the things they're doing I think are very beneficial. When I think their primary product is the DDoS protection mechanism, so that, you know, sites can be subject to denial of service attacks if they are on the wrong side of popular opinion on certain topics. And Cloudflare came up with a way to protect sites that are being hammered with denial of service attacks by simply putting a really high bandwidth kind of firewall in front of the site that could absorb the denial of service attack and allow the website to continue to function. Of course, that doesn't always work the way it's planned. I used to be a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and we published a blog called Tech Policy Daily. And we use Cloudflare's free service to protect the blog from denial of service attacks. AEI is the kind of organization that's sort of a target for a lot of that sort of antisocial behavior. But I ran into a situation once where I was unable to access the blog, a post that I'd written for the blog from my home in Colorado, due to a misconfiguration of the Cloudflare network. So Cloudflare had changed some IP addresses they hadn't told the people at AEI. And so the AEI server, which was not actually owned or controlled by Cloudflare, it was just behind the Cloudflare firewall, was unreachable to me, but people in DC could see it just fine. So it's like, well, they were saying, why is this a problem?
Let me interject and ask you one more question on this. You talked about the CDNs, and as we look at an individual user's access to certain content, who else within this ecosystem would have the opportunity to control that access or to control the speed of the individual's content access?
Well, the CDNs dump so much traffic on the internet, I think this is covered in the background memo for the hearing, that they're actually in a position to affect the rate at which non-CDN users can get their jobs done.
Okay, my time's expired. Mr. Doyle?
Thank you. Mr. Wood, a number of witnesses mentioned that 5G will precipitate the need for greater prioritization. If we dramatically increase the capacity of a network service, do we also need to dramatically increase our ability to manage the scarcity of it?
I think not. Congestion doesn't solve every problem, I heard other witnesses say, but it can solve a lot of them. And as I noted in my testimony, certain kinds of prioritization actually do happen already. The question really is who's being made to pay for that.
You know, a number of witnesses also said in their testimony they talked about the benefits of ISPs prioritizing certain kinds of traffic over others, for instance, live video, telemedicine, and online games. But what happens when you take the choice away from consumers of which packets get to them first, and ISPs are allowed to decide which applications and application providers will have optimized access to consumers and which ones won't? I mean, to me, it seems like the ISPs get to pick who wins and who loses. What do you think?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, we agree. We think retaining that user choice and the rights that users have is very important. And so you're right that certain kinds of traffic might have different network needs at different times. It should really be up to the user to choose not only which kind of traffic they might wish to pay for or prioritize, but also the source of that traffic. So will all video applications be treated the same way? That's a very tough question to answer when we're leaving that all within the ISP's control.
You know, let's talk a little bit about competition. If ISPs were allowed to implement paid prioritization for services such as telemedicine or other services, do you think that would increase or decrease the number of competitive offerings in that space? Essentially, do you think small rural health practices or small startups would want to compete against large health systems and the ISPs themselves or other large institutional players?
Yes, Congressman, thank you. I think it would decrease the amount of competitors further upstream, if you will. There's some notion that paid priority could be used to level the playing field, I suppose, and let the small businesses compete with the large businesses. I can't see how that would work. I think that if there were paid prioritization allowed, then naturally the companies with the deepest pockets and the providers with the biggest bank accounts would pay for that prioritization. It wouldn't be used to level the playing field. It would just be used to tilt it even further.
You know, a number of witnesses here today have alleged that the Open Internet Order severely restricted the types of network management an ISP could engage in. They also alleged that certain types of specialized service offerings, such as telemedicine, were prohibited. Further, they claim that prioritization is necessary to ensure the quality of certain services. Services, it seems to me, that might be best served using business data services, which I see are claimed to be too expensive. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a lot there. I do think that the Open Internet Order of 2015 did allow for reasonable network management, was a term of art used for several of the rules. So even for blocking or for throttling, there were network management exceptions. For prioritization, there was no such exception, but of course, as I noted this morning, the ban only applied to third-party payments or those done, prioritization done to benefit an affiliate of the internet service provider. So all kinds of applications could receive network management. You mentioned specialized services and other kinds of dedicated capacity. Those were fully allowed by the 2015 order. And again, even when there is a use case for prioritization on the open internet without going to a specialized service or dedicated capacity, there are protocols and methods for doing that today. They just simply don't require the edge provider to pay on top of what the broadband user is already paying for their service.
Right. Mr. Wood, the ban on paid prioritization or pay-to-play, that was a fundamental part of net neutrality, and throughout the proceeding to eliminate neutrality protections, Chairman Pai repeatedly said that the 2015 net neutrality order was a departure from the past. Yet as far back as the 1970s, the Commission had identified the potential harmful effects that could result when just a handful of gatekeepers could control consumers' access to the Internet. Has the Internet always been open and free?
We certainly think so. In the old days, you might call it, broadband providers were Title II providers. Your dial-up service worked over a phone line, and that phone company was subject to non-discrimination rules. So although the legal ground for net neutrality has shifted somewhat over the last decade as different administrations have tried to do it in different ways, the protections have always been there, and we think the 2015 version did the best job of restoring the protections we've always had.
So why were guardrails needed when the FCC opened its proceeding that resulted in the recently overturned net neutrality protection?
I'm sorry, you said why were guardrails needed?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but we do think that restoring the protections, keeping the protections we've always had was the right move. I'm not sure what guardrails you're referring to in the new proceeding.
No, in the recently overturned proceeding.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, these are fundamental rights that we think deserve protection and always have had it in some form or another, and so that's why we're looking to restore them now.
I see my time's expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Shimkus, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Great hearing, interesting issue, contentious views. I want to start with Mr. Schrader, and I want to, one, thank you for being here. And secondly, I was watching your hands. Were you reading Braille, or how did you read to us your testimony? What was going on down there?
Yeah, microphone, is it on?
It's on, you're good.
Yes, I'm reading off of a small Braille device. It's essentially a Braille computer that has my summarized testimony.
Great. And where is the lady who's assisting you through your glasses and the video? Where is actually she physically located?
Amy is in San Diego currently.
Great.
I'm taking the headphone out so she can talk if you have a question for her as well.
I hope you have a good working environment, Amy. Yeah.
You know, one of the things we found with our agents, and Amy was our lead agent and the person that developed a lot of the training that the agents now go through. She is a company employee in San Diego, but our agents love IRA, as you can imagine. They are paid, as I mentioned. It's largely home-based employment, and as long as they've got a good internet connection, they are able to provide the support for IRA users, and there's a lot of satisfaction, I know, among our agents in the kind of work that they do, from the tedious work of getting somebody through an airport or the very exciting work of actually being able to work with somebody who's touring Paris.
Yeah, and your testimony, then you can put her down. You can put her down. I don't think I got questions for her.
Down, Amy.
Yeah, in your testimony, you talked about your relationship with AT&T, and then the IRA accessibility of government buildings at this week, or
Correct.
while there are numerous people who have impaired vision on the Hill. And so it's tied into this hearing. Why do you think you're invited here to testify?
I think Ira has an interesting case to make. We've been clear from the beginning. We don't really, as you know, if you've looked at our company references, we haven't stated a position on this particular topic. But Ira has a very interesting case to make regarding prioritization, and as I noted, it's an upstream priority. So typically, when we talk about this issue of prioritized content and access to content, it's usually ensuring that users have access to content, and the discussion tends to revolve around making sure that the content goes downstream in an orderly fashion. We're the other side of that case. We need to send video upstream, and as you know, often upload speeds don't match download speeds, and so our critical case to make is that our service can't work if we don't have priority low latency access. I think we talk about 80 milliseconds is what we try to achieve or better of latency, because if somebody is out and about moving, they really do need that instant video feedback that the agent can then provide, but that video is moving in the opposite direction of what we usually talk about in these networks.
Yeah, it's excellent testimony, and you can just see someone trying to cross a busy street and then being feedback is delayed. That's a dangerous proposition to be had. I just think it really does speak to this. It's not as simple as people like to portray this debate. And I want to go to Mr. Rasavi. You say it's not a zero-sum game. Explain that. Because that's the whole debate, net neutrality, there's winners and losers. Mr. Wood articulates that but you say it's not. You can't put it in that.
It's absolutely not a zero-sum game.
And explain that.
The reason is that different applications have different requirements. If I'm trying to send a short message to an autonomous vehicle that there's a pedestrian in the road around the corner that the car can't see, that traffic does not have to adversely affect a video streaming application that already has a buffer and already has tolerance for delay in how it receives its packets.
So, and then someone else mentioned it's really not a highway. It's a network of networks.
Yes.
And so and Mr. Bennett, in your testimony, you talk about how you can manipulate a portion of the network to actually slow up the process where the quote-unquote pipe may get the original blame. It's great hearing, Madam Chairman. I wish I had more time, but I don't. I yield back.
Gentleman yells back. Let's see. So, Ms. Eshoo, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Again, thank you to the witnesses. I have to say that from the first three, I haven't heard any of you just clearly address why you think paid prioritization is a good idea. We just heard the exchange with Mr. Shimkus and the witness about different uses of the internet, but it didn't have, you didn't bring up why one case or another should have paid prioritization. So you know where I am, but I think that your job is to try to dissuade me or bring new facts to the table. And most frankly, I didn't hear them. I think that paid prioritization really needs to be examined for exactly what it is. There are many uses on the internet, but I think that we're going to, here at the committee, we have many members, including myself, that are fighting very hard for rural areas in our country to receive broadband. Some are underserved, others are not served as they should be. Put paid prioritization on top of that. How fair is that to those people? I mean, you know, the idea is to move it faster, quicker, fairer, expand it so that there's more information to the many in a democracy. So to Mr. Wood, can you explain the distinction between, because this term is being thrown around, specialized services and paid prioritization? And also, you refer to your, in your testimony to new forms of discrimination, and I think that that is, you know, that could crop up, and if you can expand on that a little, I would appreciate it.
Sure, thank you, Congresswoman. Specialized services is a term that the FCC has used over the last several years. You might think of it as dedicated access. And so I don't know IRA's business model completely, but a purchaser of a device might not actually be using that device on their own broadband network. The device might bring the broadband with it, if you will. And that's a way, if there is a need for prioritization and even for the application
And that was
maker.
included in the 2015 rule.
It was in 2010 as well, and this is the kind of thing we've always seen with what you
And
might
the
think of
court
as a private.
upheld that.
That's
Very
true.
importantly, the courts upheld that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And then as to new forms of discrimination, we just believe that the kinds of things Chairman Blackburn was describing, for example, distortion further into the network, or especially at interconnection points, as they're called, where the last mile broadband network receives all this traffic that their users are subscribing for. The users are requesting, and if it can't get to them due to some sort of blockage further up the line, or if there is some kind of new form of discriminatory treatment towards the broadband providers and users, we would like the FCC to have the ability to assess that. And the term in the statute is unreasonable discrimination, to assess whether a tactic or a technique is actually benefiting users or hurting them.
Is there anything that you know of, that you can think of, that makes the case for paid prioritization plausible or acceptable?
I mean, as I said, some people might postulate that it would save money for the broadband providers' customers. We just haven't seen that happen. And when you have so few choices among broadband
Well, how do you
providers,
save money if you're paying more?
well, you wouldn't be saving money. I think that, sometimes there's a notion that if the edge provider pays, the user won't have to. And what we think of this as is more double charging. The broadband provider's customer continues to pay for their access, and then the two-sided market, or the handout in the other direction, says now the edge provider pays as well. So as I said, I don't think that the ISPs think of this
It's
as a
about
way
as
to
clear as
save
fog,
money.
yeah. Well, I just, I wish I heard a very clear case from the wonderful first three witnesses on why paid prioritization is a very good thing for anyone using the internet, and I haven't heard it. I admire the different services that you've referred to and all of that, but I think that we've got some fog in this hearing, and paid prioritization is paid prioritization. I don't find anything foundational and positive about it. Thank you to all of you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Latta, you're recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks for our witnesses. As my friend from Illinois said, this has been a very interesting hearing. I appreciate you all being here to give your testimony today. Mr. Bennett, if I could start my questioning with you, what are the impacts of traffic management on different applications? And if all video conferencing applications such as Skype or FaceTime were in the same traffic lane as general email traffic, how would that impact each service?
Thank you for the question. Not speaking to the machine. The network operators have to manage a pool of resources. And one of the resources that's really critical is what engineers call latency. It's delay. It's how long it takes a packet to get from one point to another. Low latency is a resource that networks never have an infinite supply of. It always has to be managed. So it's very important for these video conferencing apps to have low latency, because if they don't, the picture breaks up, you hear like dropouts in the audio channel, and the overall accuracy and the feeling of sort of presence of being as if you're in the same room with the person you're talking to, you can't achieve that without very low latency. latency doesn't make any difference to email applications. I mean, they're perfectly fine with, you know, and network time is like measured in units of like millionths and billionths of a second. And email, you know, operates more at the level of like minutes and hours. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter. So when we assign effectively low latency to an email packet that doesn't need it, simply because we're sending packets in the order they were received or in some other sort of semi-random order, we're wasting a resource. And so it's actually, I think it's a bit irresponsible to just sort of treat all traffic the same, because that means we're ignoring the fundamental requirements that the users of those services have.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Rashavi, if I could ask you, in my district and across the country, there's a great deal of interest in manufacturing and other sectors that we see increased efficiency from the Internet of Things. IoT will be made of next-generation sensors and automated equipment, such as drones and robots, that can provide real-time HD video, imaging, audio, and other bandwidth-intensive sensing, monitoring, and automated processes. In a world without prioritization, can the Internet of Things become a reality?
It would come to a very partial reality. The fact is that the application and quality of service requirements for different applications vary. So there may be some IoT applications that don't need prioritization, but to expand the number of applications, to allow innovators the full range of everything that is possible, many of these techniques of quality of service management will be essential.
Okay, well, just a quick follow-up then. So what would that mean for overall U.S. competitiveness in manufacturing?
The more artificial restrictions that there are on what kind of applications can be deployed, the less competitive industry will be, because you can be assured that other countries who wish to dominate in this space are not going to handicap their technologies.
Okay. Mr. Bennett, going back, if I could do to you, we often hear about how ISPs prioritize packets to manage traffic congestion that can create a user-friendly experience. However, we see edge providers pay to prioritize search results, advertising, social network feeds, shopping options, etc. Given that this form of paid prioritization is happening every day, I'd like to understand the impact that it has on consumers.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, we can see some of the impact of the prioritization of search results and how the market has changed for product search. For a very long time, Google was the dominant company in product search, but nowadays more people begin product searches on Amazon than do it on Google. And I don't know exactly why that has happened, but I think it has something to do with the fact that when you do a Google search, the first few answers you get are all paid ads, and they're not always very relevant, you know, to what you're doing, and they're certainly not as trustworthy as the organic search. So prioritization, I think, in that sense, the company should realize that they've actually hurt their market position by distorting their search results that way, and by the fact that the Google search is just not as effective as it used to be.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. My time has expired.
Gentleman yells back. Ms. Clark, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and I thank our expert witnesses for their testimony here this morning. And given that I also serve on the Small Business Committee, I strongly believe and maintain that the rollback of net neutrality is going to have a hugely detrimental effect on small businesses. And I'm not alone in this belief. Polling indicates that an overwhelming majority of respondents are concerned that the elimination of net neutrality could disadvantage small businesses by allowing big national chains to put their online services in a fast lane. A number of small businesses in my district back in Brooklyn have been outspoken about this. Small businesses like Take Shape and Staff Base, and I co-sponsored the CRA to reinstate net neutrality in part due to their concerns. Given that, Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to introduce a letter for the record. And this record, it opposes the FCC's rollback of net neutrality and is signed by 800 small businesses.
Without objection.
I thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Wood, why are small businesses so concerned about the rollback of net neutrality? And why is rolling back the ban on paid prioritization worrying these businesses?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think it's pretty clear and simple. They don't want to have to pay extra to deliver their content to their customers. Now, it's not true that they're not paying. They pay a lot to get their content onto the internet, and they pay their own broadband provider, or sometimes they're even able to build their own connections. What we're talking about here is then paying my ISP at home a separate charge, either to cut in line in front of somebody else, or perhaps just to get the traffic to me in the first place. And it's that extra and frankly new toll that I think has small businesses worried. I saw the poll that I think you're referring to, and it was something like 4-to-1 small businesses opposed to the repeal and worried about paid priority. A large number of them were uncertain how it would affect their business, so I find it funny that in the name of creating more certainty, we've actually created great uncertainty for small businesses who thought this was unsettled. But that's the kind of fear they're facing, is are there going to be new tolls and new charges that I must pay just to get my content to my customers?
Very well. I've also been a strong advocate of diversity in traditional media companies, and that's why, along with my colleagues, I created the Multicultural Media Caucus here in the House. The sad truth is that diverse voices are seldom truly represented in traditional media, but net neutrality can in some ways help fix that problem. Mr. Wood, why is net neutrality important for groups that are not well represented in traditional media?
Thank you, Congressman. I think it's for exactly that reason. It doesn't eliminate all barriers, but it lowers the barriers to speaking in one's own voice and getting your story out there. And so traditionally, communities of color have not been well represented on the airwaves. The internet helps to change that. Again, I think the notion that some have tried to put forward in this hearing is that prioritization and paid prioritization could help them compete with the biggest content providers. And I just can't see how that would work. I think if we did allow for paid prioritization, then the traditional media companies would be the first in line and the highest bidders for such slots, and that the less well-known and less well-established media companies and voices would be pushed to the back of the line.
Very well. And I remain concerned about the impact paid prioritization can have on innovation and new ideas and on new products. When a programmer in my district comes up with the next big idea, how can we help ensure her focus is on connecting with her users? And this question is to Mr. Wood and Mr. Schroeder.
I'll go just because the mic's on. I think this is how we can do it, is by preserving the internet as it always has been, where people pay their own broadband connection, but then are not asked to pay an additional toll just to reach the other side of that connection. And we have each side of the conversation paying for their connectivity, but not this extra toll where the ISP charges in both directions.
I think thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I think for IRA, we're a company that serves a rather small and underserved customer base, providing a unique service, right? So people who are blind or visually impaired constitute, maybe 23 million of the population. The people who need our service don't really have an adequate technology-based solution. What most people would do is try to find a sighted assistant to provide some access to visual information, and there isn't always a sighted assistant around, and frankly, there isn't always a competent sighted assistant around to provide access to information. Getting to our users has been a real challenge, but to answer maybe the question you didn't ask, but for us, one of the limitations we worry about is, and one of the things we've seen before we had access to the dynamic traffic management that AT&T offers on its essentially high priority private network, is that our users were not able to get their video through in a way that actually worked because there were too many lags, too many delays, and too many dropped calls, and so they weren't able to have access to competent assistance using the IRA model.
I thank you, Mr. Schroeder, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Guthrie, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, and appreciate the hearing. And this question is for Mr. Bennett, probably continuing on some of the same theme, is that I'd like to discuss the debate over ISPs taking advantage of their gatekeeper position at the last mile connection points by prioritizing content delivery for those who pay the most or even holding content hostage, and the counter position that they wouldn't have a viable business model if they did this. I may be oversimplifying this, but it seems to boil down to questions about relative bargaining positions within edge providers and ISPs, and who has the unique advantage in this regard. So the question, in the development of the internet as we know it today, has there been a need for or practice of paying for priority of content delivery over the last mile?
It certainly hasn't been a widespread practice, if it has existed at all. There have been certainly a lot of claims that ISPs were holding certain content providers hostage for payment. In 2014, Netflix accused the major ISPs of doing that to them, but it turns out the network that was actually slowing their traffic down was their transit provider, Cogent. The ISPs didn't really have anything to do with it.
So if it exists, you don't know of it, that's what you're saying?
It certainly hasn't been widespread. I mean, in fact, I would like to see more willingness on the part of ISPs to sell prioritized delivery to application providers that had real-time apps, like video conferencing, and they can't really, have never really seen much reason how that would benefit them to sell that service, because it would actually make third parties able to do, provide voice and FaceTime just as well as the native products sold by the ISPs. This is especially the case with the wireless ISPs.
So who has the stronger bargaining position over the last mile? And what if ISPs with less than 1 million customers dealing with an edge provider has tens of millions of customers for their platform services?
Well, if the day an ISP announces that it's not going to allow Netflix to use its network because, it has some dispute and it's not getting the money, that's the day, pretty much the day that you should short that ISP. Mm-hmm. As nobody has that kind of the bargaining position that Amazon and Netflix and Google have. If those are regarded as essential services by users of ISPs, there's no way the ISP can mess with them.
Because a lot of my ISPs at the last mile are local, like utilities, Bardstown City Cable is the ISP, Logan Telephone, Telegraph is the ISP for the last mile for a lot of the areas there that wouldn't have that kind of bargaining power that you're talking about. In your testimony also, you say sharing is inherent in the Internet's design, and go on to say access to shared resources of any kind implies the development and implementation of a sharing policy. Can you elaborate on what options network operators have to manage shared access to a scarce resource? In particular, how does class of service or smart queuing techniques alleviate congestion when network load increases to moderate or high levels?
Well, the purpose of class of service or type of service in IP is to identify, for the application to identify, tell the network what kind of service it needs, if it's low precedence or whether their focus is capacity or reliability. The trouble with that is that typically, and that's used internally by ISPs once they're able to determine what application generated a particular traffic stream, which they can only do with a fair degree of accuracy, but it's never going to be 100%, especially as new applications emerge and that the ISP hadn't seen before, and they're like, how do I treat this? Do I treat it just like generic traffic, and which is probably 95%, or it could be as much as 95% of the internet, or do I give it some sort of specialized treatment? And the specialized treatment could be like it needs to be more urgently delivered than generic traffic, but it also could be less. And so there's a case to be made for like actually, if we can recognize the unique performance characteristics of different streams and then bargain appropriately. For some streams, they're going to save money because if it's like a patch distribution or something that can happen at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's, doesn't make sense for the ISP to charge a whole lot for that. And in fact, it kind of makes sense to give it away for free because it makes their network work better if all the computers are patched and up to date.
So who manages these techniques? I got about 10 seconds.
Yeah, they're managed by network operations staff at the ISPs, and the tricky part though is at the boundaries between different ISPs or different networks, between an ISP and a transit network. And so they operate on the basis of agreements, and they typically don't articulate the treatment of non-standard traffic.
Thank you. My time's expired. Yep.
Mr. McNerney, you're recognized 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the chair and I thank the witnesses. As an engineer, I'm deeply concerned and troubled by the FCC's decision to repeal the ban on paid prioritization and kick the scraps of net neutrality over to the Federal Trade Commission. Mr. Wood, does the FTC have the resources to enforce net neutrality?
Thank you, Congressman. To my knowledge, they do not. They have an enforcement-geared staff, and I think they do a good job, but have trouble keeping up with the current caseload they have, in my understanding.
I've heard they don't have any network engineers. Is that right?
That's what I've heard as well, yes, Congressman.
Well, I'm concerned that without an expert agency with network engineers on the case, we might never know if there are violations of net neutralities. Back in 2007, we only discovered net neutrality violations due to the work of an engineer working at home on his own. Might it be difficult for the average consumer to recognize their broadband provider is violating net neutrality?
Yes, Congressman, I think it could. And in fact, with nobody to watch over that process, I do think that would be a problem. As we've heard, congestion can happen at different places in the internet and different parts of the network. The Netflix and Comcast disputes that Mr. Bennett referenced, a lot of people called their Comcast customer service representatives and said it's not coming through correctly. And the first answer from the company was maybe you should buy a faster speed tier, which wouldn't actually have solved the problem. So I think even the people who work in the network, either for good faith reasons or marketing purposes, might not be able to pinpoint where the problem is and then actually help the customer to solve it.
Thank you. About veterans, in response to thousands of constituents who reached to me concerning their concerns about the elimination of net neutrality protections, I had a net neutrality town hall in my district to discuss their concerns. At the town hall, I heard from a veteran who was very worried about what this would mean for him and other veterans, including their access to health telenet services. Mr. Wood, given your experience with net neutrality, do you think veterans who need home telehealth services for in-home care should be concerned about the FCC's rollback of net neutrality?
I do, Congressman. I think what they want is for the service to work. And so as we've heard, there could be different use cases, different types of prioritization that the network already does to make sure that all applications can reach their destination. What I think veterans are worried about overseas is I'm already paying for my connection, which might be difficult to manage overseas. My family's paying at home. Is there going to be a new toll or a new kind of charge to make sure that traffic can actually reach its destination? And I think that's where the concern comes from, that this will be a new fee that's ultimately passed on to customers, even if it's the edge provider who is paying it in the first place.
Mr. Schroeder, do you have similar concerns about access with net neutrality protections disappearing?
For the purposes of IRA's technology, again, we're concerned that we have access to a cell network that can deliver our video upstream in a way that is reliable. I don't know that the end of the open internet order would adversely or would have changed our business model significantly if whether or not that order was in place. I do think it is critical that we ensure that our veterans have access to the kind of service that IRA is providing. And I would say that given the relatively underserved group that we are reaching out to, my sense is that that's not a group that probably gets priority under any structure. And so without a company like IRA really pushing that issue, and in our case having a good partner with AT&T in order to allow us to use a priority network, I'm not sure that that service would be provided, our business model and our service would be provided in a way that actually works for people in the real world as we have to make it work.
Has IRA come out in favor of the Mr. Doyle's CRA?
We have not taken a position on any of the bills.
You refer to low latency several times in your testimony. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, low latency means a connection with no delays or minimal delays. And so in our case, as we said, our video needs to be able to move through at what we've estimated currently at ideally 4 Mbps. We think with the new glasses that I'm wearing, these are called Horizon. By the way, they're actually made almost entirely in San Diego, so it's all U.S. based. We're proud to say. that we may even need a little bit higher bandwidth in order to ensure that the quality of the video that these glasses are able to provide gets through. And the comment about busy streets and crossing streets, while IRA makes clear that we do not provide information to somebody in the midst of a street crossing because we want them to use their other skills, we do note that people need information very rapidly and very immediately, including out on the street, in order to avoid obstacles.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Olson.
I thank the chair and welcome to our 4 witnesses. This question is for the entire panel. We'll just go from your right to left. Just get your thoughts on prioritization. My hometown of Houston, Texas was hit by Hurricane Harvey really hard this past August. Hit us not once, hit us twice. Some parts of my district had 50 inches of rain, almost 5 feet of rain in 2 days. The amazing efforts of the Houston local first responders before, during, and after Hurricane Harvey saved thousands of lives. With prioritization, isn't that important for our first responders? Shouldn't their traffic be prioritized in times of emergency? Mr. Bennett?
Yes, Congressman Olson, it certainly should. It's part of the, as a former Houstonian who lived through Carla, I'm quite sensitive to, what went on down there recently. FirstNet is primarily, it's sort of the value proposition for FirstNet, other than interoperability between first responders, is the ability to get, what they call it, prioritized quality, preemption and priority. It's quality, preemption, and priority, so that first responders not only can get a connection during times of emergency. Civilians want to use the networks and call people and let them know they're okay or they're not okay, and call for help and all that. So there's a lot of pressure on the networks from facilities being down and high usage, and so, but we definitely want first responders to have priority access.
Mr. Asavi, your comments on priority access during times of natural disaster like Hurricane Harvey?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Yes, absolutely. That's a perfect example of a situation where certain users, such as the first responders, do need access. But it's just an example of many, because from there you might consider a surgeon doing remote surgery, and they might need prioritization as well. Thank you.
Mr. Schrader.
I think emergencies provide 2 interesting examples of why IRA is so critical and why making sure that our information is getting through. First one is a lot of the information that is provided during an emergency is inherently visual. There's maps and charts and graphics on television screens that indicate where one is supposed to go, what the storm pattern is, that sort of thing. Without access to IRA, it is very difficult for a person to get that information in a reliable sense. When somebody is relocated, if you can imagine a person who's blind, they're in an unusual setting, having access to IRA and a reliable visual assistant will allow that person to have better access to the shelter and have of course, a better experience. Somebody might say that that's perhaps not critical. I would disagree. I think if somebody is relocated who's blind or visually impaired, they certainly need to be able to access the information around them successfully, just like anybody else who's been relocated to that area. And IRA ensuring that our video gets through is another way that that person is able to have the information about where they are, as well as things that they need to know related to surviving that emergency.
Amen. Mr. Wood, your comments on prioritization during the natural disasters?
Certainly, thank you, Congressman. Yes, first responders deserve priority during disasters. I would say that was fully permitted under the 2015 rules that have now been repealed. And the last thing I would want is paid prioritization for first responders. I can't imagine having the ambulance or the fire department pay an additional toll on their way to the emergency. So I think that draws out the distinction we're talking about here.
Good point. Final question for you, Mr. Bennett. Your testimony discussed internet optimization. And as you're well aware, we're at the beginning of a huge data boom, another massive data boom. Could you elaborate on possible tools that can be used in the future to help further efficiencies, to optimize the internet traffic, and also what role does AI play in the future?
AI is going to be essential, I think, to identifying traffic streams and mapping them to applications and determining what kind of service they need. It's something that the capability to do that has sort of increased an awful lot in network routers over the years. And, well, it's sort of hard to draw the line between just sort of better programming and AI. I mean, it definitely leans toward the side of AI, the kind of intelligence that networks have to have these days.
My time is expired. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Engel, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member. When Mark Zuckerberg was before our committee last week, one of the things I asked him was about foreign influence in our democracy. In the FCC's docket that rolled back the ban on paid prioritization and the other net neutrality protections, Americans' identities were stolen and used to comment in support of Chairman Pai's rollback of net neutrality. It seems like another attempt at sowing division. Mr. Wood, have you received any of these fake comments filed in the FCC's docket?
Thank you, Congressman. Have I seen them? Is that the question? I have seen some sampling of the 24 million comments, yes, and I know that there have been allegations about fake comments coming from foreign sources and from all sides.
Do you think the FCC has done enough to address the fake comments in the record?
No, I certainly don't. In fact, the Attorney General of New York has tried to launch an investigation on behalf of New York State residents whose identities were stolen and inappropriately used in the proceeding. And I think it's fair to say the answer they've gotten from the FCC has been something of a shoulder shrug to this point. So I don't think the FCC has either used all of its own tools or cooperated strongly enough with other law enforcement agencies who want to look into this.
What else should they have done?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good question. We want to have maximum participation in these public decision-making processes. So I don't know if there's much they could have done to stop the inflow of any fake or fraudulent comments. I've heard that even several members of Congress had their names used, including their street addresses, so it wasn't just a matter of filling in a fake name. I don't know what more they could have done at the beginning, but I do think they should have paused and considered what to do about the bad comments flowing into the record during the process, and then maybe should have taken longer to consider what to do with them before voting.
Would you anticipate legal challenges to the FCC's order repealing net neutrality based on the fake comments?
Well, we have actually filed suit. It's something like 23 attorneys general, a dozen or more public interest organizations like ours, and internet companies as well, and also some local, for example, Santa Clara County and the California Public Utilities Commission. I think that will be part of the case. I can't tell you how much it will be part of the arguments or the judge's response to it.
Mr. Wood, let me stick with you. You testified that getting rid of paid prioritization would radically change the Internet. You said that the ban only prevented ISPs from favoring traffic in exchange for payments from third parties or to benefit an ISP's affiliated video or voice offers. But it did not ban user-directed traffic. So can you expand on that and explain a little more about how user-directed traffic works?
Certainly, I hope so. The internet protocols that already manage these kinds of different needs for different types of applications, that goes on today. I think all the witnesses have spoken to that in some degree. And that kind of process was not prohibited by the paid prioritization ban. All that the rule prohibited was having an edge provider or some other third party come in and try to alter that natural balancing that goes on. If the balancing couldn't happen in what I would call a neutral fashion, with the protocols just deciding which applications need priority at that particular point in time, then the user could also pay their broadband provider, and we have more comfort with that because then the internet user remains in control of how their connection is being used, so which content they can get and also which type of applications and services they might need to or choose to prioritize at a particular point in the day.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Billaracus, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. I want to thank the panel for their testimony as well. Mr. Schrader, as stated in your testimony, the speed of your service is near instantaneous. And when you discuss how the service is used, not only for work-related tasks, but helping people navigate city streets, speed is clearly a requirement. Isn't that the case?
Yes, Congressman Bill.
Yes. It seems your partnership with AT&T is central to your service. Isn't that the case?
It is a very important element, yes.
Yeah. Can you describe how the user experience would be different if IRA did not have this partnership and had to compete equally with all other internet traffic?
I can, because we rolled out the relationship with AT&T's Dynamic Traffic Management Network over the last 4 to 6 months. Prior to that time, we got many complaints from our users, and I am an IRA user myself, and I also experienced many dropped calls, many significant delays in video, many instances where we had an audio connection with the agent but no video, and they did their best using GPS and other sensor data that we were able to get upstream. But the lag in video created not only trouble for our business model, because we are a service that people subscribe to, but more important, created challenges for people who are blind, who in the midst of needing a sign read to them, needing to make a decision about which direction to go, needing to find that last, you talk about the last mile, we often talk about the last 20 feet trying to find the right door. And oftentimes that's when the video would unfortunately kick out. And so just when you needed the information most. So I know, and I know our users experienced what the network situation was like before we had access to a priority network, and it was not a good experience.
So you just described the latency consequences.
That's correct.
Yes. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Next question: as a relatively new company, did you find it difficult to get a partner that would provide the prioritization services that your company needs to operate?
You know, sometimes I'm a little bit embarrassed. IRA gets a lot of attention. I think a lot of people find what we do to be quite remarkable and quite amazing. We actually had no trouble finding interest among carriers to work with IRA and to allow us to encourage us to work with their cell networks. AT&T was the company that came through with the best partnership and really showed the most interest and giving us opportunity to work with their priority network, as well as I mentioned in my testimony, providing support for getting IRA into the hands of college students and in working with us on designing some of the technology that we're using, for example, to get access to prescription medication, which is one of the highest use cases that our IRA users often need to ensure that they're taking the right medicine.
That's great. I want to commend you for working with our veterans as customers, but also as employees. But I also want to give you an opportunity, because I do have some time, to describe how IRA works and how beneficial it is to your customers, if you please. And so if you can elaborate a little bit more on it, because it is fascinating and it improves a person's quality of life.
We thank you for that, Congressman Milarakis. And I appreciate your support as well. We have so many wonderful stories from our IRA users who use the service, of course, in critical ways like navigating the Boston Marathon, which trying to move among runners, as you can imagine, is a very dicey proposition, especially in the weather conditions they had yesterday. And it speaks to the need for having a very strong network with low latency available to them. We've also had individuals who have spent a few hours working with an agent putting IKEA furniture together. And I don't know if I should mention a specific company, but I think we all know how challenging following some of those visual directions, if you can see, can be. Many of our users have found IRA to be extraordinarily helpful in navigating technology. There's a lot of great technology, such as what I'm using here with this Braille device, that makes information available to blind people, but it sometimes doesn't work. It sometimes breaks down, and when it breaks down, we're suddenly we're confronted with a blank screen, blank to us because we can't see it, and being able to quickly grab an IRA agent via the smart glasses and application allows us to have access to what is on that screen, so we can hopefully save our work and be able to continue to be productive. Oftentimes in the past, I know the time is up, but oftentimes in the past, it would take several minutes or maybe hours to find somebody sighted to come and help figure out what was on that computer screen. Now we've got that instantaneous with IRA.
Well, thank you very much. I know it's very beneficial to our constituents. I appreciate it, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'd ask to enter into the record a article written today by Rosalind Layton of AEI. It's called Prioritization, Moving Past Prejudice to Make the Internet Policy Based on Fact.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Bennett, talking about 5G for a minute, the next leap in technology for wireless, does China have a ban on paid prioritization?
Not as far as I know. The telecom carriers in China are state-owned enterprises.
Right.
And they're pretty much able to.
How about Japan?
Japan, I don't think it does.
They don't. And South Korea? They have a ban on paid prioritization.
No, definitely not. South Korea offers all kinds of gradations of internet.
We talked about discrimination against rural communities. Let's assume this fact pattern for a minute. You've got an ISP that has an internet pipe going into a rural community. That rural pipe drives or carries the traffic for our new 5G network that we have in that rural community, but it's a limited size pipe. So you're going to have 5G traffic, you're going to have RS traffic going over it, you're going to have FirstNet going over it, hospital, schools, and then on a Saturday night, 80% of the traffic is going to be coming through because of video. What happens if you don't have paid prioritization? What happens to everybody's traffic under that scenario?
Well, if you don't prioritize, then what happens is when network load increases, then latency increases, and sort of every app is affected to some degree. And the more sensitive apps are affected more seriously.
Okay.
So I think one of the implications that for rural users is if you can't get consistently low latency for Skype, then you're going to have to keep on paying for an old-timey telephone connection because your Skype's just never going to be reliable.
And Mr. Schroeder, what would that do to your IRA users if you're in that community? Without paid prioritization. Again, there's no paid prioritization.
Yeah, we do have users in rural areas, and there is often a struggle to ensure that we've got good network access for those individuals. That is something that we certainly look forward to further network development.
And so Mr. Woods talked a lot about discrimination against different populations that because of a paid prioritization. Sounds to me like the opposite's true. If you have a ban on paid prioritization, it would discriminate against your population of site-limited and also veterans. Does that make sense?
We don't know.
Again, using the same example.
Congressman, we don't know whether that's true or not, but we suspect, what we do know is that having access to a reliable network is critical, and in this case, we're able to use a priority network for that purpose, so that is helping.
Okay. And so, but if you didn't have access to that paid priority network, then you wouldn't be able to have that service with the low latency.
Our service certainly suffered prior to that access.
Mr. Bennett, in order to offset that, you've got this community, it's got a new 5G network, it's got limited last mile capability. Who pays to expand the capacity?
In the absence of anyone else coming up with the desire to do that, it's going to be the carrier.
Okay. And so then,
who's going to pass the cost on to the consumer?
Right. So essentially, if you don't have paid prioritization, then everybody pays to offset the latency issues that are introduced because of a ban on paid prioritization. Is that correct?
And absolutely, just as today, the people who don't use Netflix pay for the capacity upgrades that enable others to use Netflix.
Okay. So again, the cost is being socialized for the people that want to use lots of bandwidth across the entire population, even those who don't use the bandwidth. That doesn't sound fair to me. We have a population that pays for priority TSA pre-check, pays for toll lanes, pays to use UPS instead of the mail service, or pays for priority mail. It seems to me like folks ought to pay for their fair share. Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Brooks, you're recognized. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to just clear up and make sure we're all on the same page relative to FirstNet. FirstNet obviously being the network that has been created most recently to ensure that public safety has the ability to communicate and gets priority in the case of emergencies and disasters, and is now just beginning to be built out and across the country and so forth. But there is a ban on paid prioritization involving FirstNet, is there not? I'm a little bit confused, Mr. Bennett.
There's not. FirstNet is a special purpose network that's separate from the regular, or is sort of a supplement to the regular mobile network. But the preemption of the revocation of the old Title II regulations that were enacted by Chairman Wheeler means that there is no ban on paid prioritization for anyone.
Okay. And so how is it that we can ensure that FirstNet, for instance, will receive that priority in an instance of a disaster?
Well, FirstNet is designed to do that. So if it doesn't do that, then it's failed to meet its primary goal, which is quality, preemption, and prioritization. So the thing that worries me about FirstNet is because it does so many things that fall outside the realm of what the traditional net neutrality advocates have demanded. What's to prevent one of them, Mr. Wood's organization or some similar organization, from simply filing a suit against FirstNet for violating net neutrality?
Mr. Wood, you brought this up a little bit. Can you please comment on this? Because I do want to make sure that we all are on the same page when it comes to the importance and the preemption of FirstNet. Can you please comment?
Certainly, Congresswoman. I think my earlier answer was that yes, emergency services deserve priority. They could have had that under the rules that have now been repealed. Mr. Bennett's correct that they don't face any such rules today because there are no rules in place at the moment, or at least there won't be when the rule changes take effect here in the next few weeks. But again, I think what we keep missing is the distinction between prioritization and paid prioritization. And so again, the last thing I would want is for first responders to have to pay to prioritize their traffic during times of emergency. They were able to prioritize for any kind of public safety or emergency use case under the old rules, and I think that's what should continue now.
But that's not being contemplated right now, is it?
I think what's being contemplated is FirstNet is actually designed to be a prioritized network for first responders, and that would not have violated the 2015 rules that have now been repealed. It's not a violation of anything now. It's nothing that we would fight against. We have 3 lawyers, so we're not really in the business of filing more lawsuits than we need to.
Okay, so you have no plans on filing any lawsuits?
Certainly not.
Okay.
Could I?
Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
Is that Mr. Wood says that paid prioritization is not part of FirstNet, but first responders pay to be part of FirstNet. They pay to use it's not a free service, right? It's partially paid for by fees that states and municipalities give up to be part of that network. And so then once they've paid those fees, then they get all the prioritization they need.
So how will a ban on paid prioritization implicate FirstNet, Mr. Bennett?
I'm not sure that it would for the use of the primary channel, but first responders, but FirstNet is designed to actually use bandwidth that's available over regular commercial networks as well when it needs to. And so I think there could be scenarios in that secondary usage of the other channels that could subject FirstNet certainly to a challenge.
Very briefly, Mr. Rasavi, shifting gears a minute, can you comment on how 5G will inherently prioritize traffic to handle a wider range of applications than 4G?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. 5G is being designed with a very sophisticated quality of service architecture with which traffic flows can be managed not only for priority but also for latency, possibility of packet loss, guaranteed bandwidth, and so forth. So you really need to manage all of those aspects to be able to provide services exactly the type of performance that they need.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back.
Gentlelady yells back, Mr. Doyle just told me that baseball players get priority. So he
Good-
favors priority.
Good ones.
So
Good ones
you
get
are
on the committee.
you're recognized.
Given that I'm the only other Democratic member here and that I've had my share of splinters collected sitting on the bench, I appreciate that, Coach Doyle. Thank you. As a physician, I think we have obligation to make sure that we're using the internet and technology to help improve the public's health. The FCC's 2015 net neutrality protections actually came up with a very targeted way to ensure specialized services like telehealth and public safety technology were allowed to thrive. But I'm concerned that the current FCC has done the opposite by abandoning any protections that prohibit big corporations from paying for their services to be prioritized over these telehealth type services. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce a letter for the record from the American Medical Informatics Association that expresses these concerns.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. So my first question is for Mr. Wood. It's very simple. Is there anything in the FCC's most recent net neutrality order that will guarantee hospitals, community health clinics, and local police departments won't just get pushed into slower lanes because they can't afford to bid against the big mega corporations down the road?
Thank you, Congressman. Not to my knowledge, no. The current order basically took away all of the traffic management rules and guidelines and left it to the ISPs. It has some transparency obligations that they face, but nothing that would speak to their ability to either charge for priority or not.
Yeah. So there are no safeguards to guarantee that these vital public health services are protected and not marginalized for profit motive.
That's right. To my knowledge, there are no safeguards, and basically this FCC has washed its hands of the business and said that they are not going to have any rules whatsoever when it comes to what ISPs try to prioritize or not.
Okay, and what would you do to ensure those safeguards?
Well, we have supported the Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval to restore the 2015 order. We feel it's important to restore the entirety of the rules that were lost, but also the FCC's ability to investigate if something like that were to occur. So sometimes this is talked about in a competition framework, and that matters, but we would certainly want the FCC to have the ability to investigate if it were a certain kind of telemedicine or health application being discriminated against, even if that were not to favor another telemedicine application, but simply were a bad choice made by the cable or phone company.
Okay. And as a lawyer that follows net neutrality closely, can you explain what it means that the FCC's original net neutrality protections treated telehealth as a specialized service? What does that mean?
Well, it means that they were allowed to be treated as specialized services. I would note that I think many telehealth applications can and do run over the open internet. So it's not the case that every health application or every medicine application even has to be treated as a specialized service. I don't know if the word has a lot of meaning for folks. I sometimes think of it as dedicated capacity. And so if you have an application that does not fit well on the open internet, it needs additional protections, then it could be treated as a specialized service. Again, usually paid for by the person who has the arrangement with the ISP. So not necessarily this additional kind of toll where they're paying twice, both for their own connectivity and for priority in the last mile, but simply arranging their own kind of delivery privately.
One of the biggest challenges that we have is in rural America, where you don't have population centers that can access the infrastructure for broadband and other things, even for commercial use. These are exactly the locations where we want to promote telehealth because they need access to doctors and healthcare services. Do you think it's a valid concern that without the strong net neutrality protections, we might undermine innovation in the medical space and elsewhere?
I do, Congressman. I think that the genius of the internet has been that application makers can come up with their ideas and then not have to pay an additional toll to bring them to market or to get them through that last mile to the user. And so when you do have a small ISP, I have the same concerns Not just that the small ISP might serve as a bottleneck, but if they really were at a bargaining disadvantage with the biggest edge providers, then perhaps that content would be prioritized rather than the small application makers or innovators.
We're starting to see a lot of tech medicine type opportunities for people in rural areas that haven't been served for mental health purposes. And so now you're seeing folks on their phones or their iPads, their computers, being able to actually have counseling for the first time and be connected with other addiction services groups to provide a social support networks to get the care that they need. And so I'm just concerned that this is going to inhibit that progress that is being made out there. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for joining our panel today. Mr. Schrader, a lot of parties paying attention to this hearing have pushed the idea that we don't need to worry about whether an application like IRA could avoid a paid prioritization ban in the future, since past net neutrality attempts have always included an exception for specialized services. Setting aside the problem that past performance does not predict future results, that is actually incorrect. The 2015 Open Internet Order specifically rejected the, quote, specialized services, unquote, carve-out, providing instead an exception for services that are not broadband internet access service, unless a service that is not broadband internet access service is provided in a manner that undermines the purpose of the Open Internet rules. Now, do you understand what that means? Because nobody else understands what that means.
No, Congressman, the way you phrased it, I can't untangle that thicket.
Yeah, well, nobody else can either. Mr. Rasavi, your thoughts on this. Would that definition give you any confidence that some of these services we're talking about would meet the FCC's approval?
Congressman, thank you for asking. No, not at all. The exception for specialized services is ill-defined and certainly does not foster innovation or any confidence in moving forward with such applications.
All right, well, thank you. You know, the devil's in the details. This is one we need to make sure we get right, or a paid prioritization restriction could do some real harm. Mr. Wood, moving on to you. You seem to indicate in your testimony that broadband was considered a Title II service until the Bush FCC tinkered with its classifications. What you didn't mention, though, was that the Obama FCC agreed with that classification of broadband as an information service and left it there in its first attempt at net neutrality rules in 2010. And even the 2015 Open Internet Order acknowledged the long track record here. It spelled out all the history and tied the determination that broadband was an information service all the way back to the computer inquiries that the FCC had decided over 50 years ago. The Commission was very specific that it was changing its mind and disavowing all the previous precedent to reclassify broadband into a Title II telecommunication service. So, do you disagree with the determination by Chairman Wheeler that before 2015, broadband had always been an information service?
I don't know that he said it precisely that way, but I do disagree with that phrasing. Before 2015, you mentioned the first Obama administration attempted net neutrality rules. Like the rules that were adopted at the tail end of the Bush administration, those were struck down in court. So there's a reason that we went back to the drawing board and talked about it again. The dispute here is not so much whether broadband was an information service, but whether internet access was. And there are two parts of that. There's the connection that gets you online, and then there's the service or the content you interact with once you're there. So there has been some historical dispute about whether something like AOL, for example, was an information service. I would say that it was. It was allowing you to browse the internet, but only once you got to that site using your phone connection. And what we say is that from 2000, well, really before 2002, all internet access, that physical connection, was Title II. The FCC started to change that and said that access over a cable line could be considered an information service. And that's when the attempts to prevent discrimination on those lines started to fall down in court. So that's why the FCC returned to what we see as the rightful legal definition.
Gotcha. Okay. Mr. Bennett, most of us subscribe to mass market retail broadband. This means that rather than each of us having a dedicated pipe to just our home, we're sharing bandwidth with all of our neighbors who also subscribe to that same service. So if everyone on my street is streaming videos in the evening, the broadband speeds I'm getting might be slower than I would experience at another time when not as many users are on the connection. So here's my question to you. What happens if there's an emergency that I need to call 911 on my voice over IP enabled phone? Since that call goes over my broadband connection at some point, will it also be caught up in that video congestion? Will my 911 call be degraded so someone can watch a cat video?
The short answer is yes.
Okay, that's about all I can ask for. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Walters, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being here. When talking to my constituents back home about tech issues, one of the questions I've been asked is how prioritization could impact them. I know some of my colleagues have covered a couple of these issues, but I'd like to ask a few questions that some of my constituents have been asking me. One thing that comes up is the issue of degradation and internet traffic management. Some people have expressed concerns that prioritizing certain traffic over other degrades the traffic that is not prioritized. Mr. Bennett, in your testimony, you mentioned the differentiated treatment of internet traffic report, which, quote, demonstrates that traffic differentiation is not a zero-sum game. Could you explain what that means for the average internet consumer?
Yes, I can. I was a member of the committee that wrote that report. The point is that because applications are not all created equal, a sort of a theoretical or a literal degradation of an individual piece of information by a millionth of a second or so may qualify in a legal sense as a degradation. It's not a degradation that the consumer will perceive. And so given that we're placing so much importance on polling, and which is sort of a question of measuring perception, the question is whether there's a perceptible degradation. And in that sense, prioritization is certainly provably, empirically, without a doubt, unquestionably not a zero-sum game.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Rezeve, in your testimony, you talked about network slicing and its relationship to quality of service management. Can you explain the concept of network slicing in layman's terms and how it affects the average consumer?
Network slicing, thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. Network slicing is an architectural aspect of 5G. Basically, it's a way that the network will present different faces for different usages. So in theory, an operator could develop a slice for autonomous vehicles, another slice for factory automation, and so forth. And each of these will require very specific quality of service requirements, among which traffic prioritization is essential. What it translates to the user is that with network slicing, they will see a wide range of new innovative services coming to market.
Okay, thank you. And throughout this hearing, there's been a discussion about the different forms of prioritization. And I think we can all agree that there are instances where certain traffic has to be prioritized over others, like the example that we've been hearing a lot lately is the prioritizing 9/11 call over a cat video. Mr. Bennett, can you talk about types of bad prioritization, including types we should actively prevent?
Yeah, I think any sort of negative prioritization that's intended to impair the performance of a competitive product to the carrier is something that should be looked at with suspicion. But I think it's sort of covered under general antitrust law. I'm not a lawyer like Mr. Wood is, so I can't really justify that. But it's my sense, the way it's been explained to me, that the violations that we're concerned about are essentially already prohibited under sort of the general laws of regulating business in the U.S.
Mr. Wood, would you want to add anything to that?
I could. I think that antitrust could be a remedy for some competitors, say if Comcast decided to block Netflix. I don't think it would be a very useful remedy in all instances, especially if it were smaller video providers who were suffering from that kind of blockage or deprioritization. And I think all we have to do is look at cable TV, where when you don't have some kind of common carrier mantra and framework, cable TV is not illegal under the antitrust standards. Cable providers do pick and choose which content to show you. The question is, should we have no safeguards whatsoever and make the internet more like cable TV, or should we have the same kind of two-way open transmission network we've had that lets people go to any site of their choosing?
And what should Congress consider doing to prevent these types of prioritization activities from occurring? And Mr. Bennett and then Mr. Wood, if you'd like to join in.
I would rather that Congress adopt a generally permissive attitude. Like there's been so much demonization and so much sort of emotional rhetoric and spin in framing in this discussion that I think it's just sort of, we've gone way overboard on the side of caution. So let's let a few things happen. Let's allow some experiments like IRA to take place and examine the marketplace. And if something is going wrong, then step in and correct it, but preemptively allow people to innovate.
Oh, my time's up. So, thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Costello, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Rasavi, I enjoyed reading your testimony.
Thank you.
And found it very helpful. I want to cite something and ask you this question. Mission critical use case model type analysis that you provided. You state this category of 5G application will depend on the ability to deploy traffic prioritization. Can you just briefly explain why prioritization will be necessary for 5G? Is it necessary, and if so, why?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Yes, prioritization is an absolutely essential aspect of 5G in enabling new use cases. The whole motivation for investing hundreds of billions of dollars in 5G networks is to expand what can be done with wireless technologies, and being able to support mission-critical applications is going to be a great expansion of capability compared to 4G.
Along that line, and I think the terminology here, I think everybody supports net neutrality, broadly speaking. Certain types of paid prioritization, I think, obviously do fall under FTC and are anti-competitive. When you speak about prioritization here, what you're speaking about is organizing slices based on the type of data and what it's used for. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is there a better way for you to, would you embellish on that if need be, or was that?
No, the whole point is to recognize that different types of applications have different requirements. Some may need very high bandwidth, but can drop a lot of packets because it won't impact the user experience. Others might be very low bandwidth, but the reliability of the information carried might be absolutely crucial.
You go on to say, but unprioritized and competing with other traffic, the latency can be 10 times higher, for example. And then you go on. And what you're saying there, I believe, is that if we don't have prioritization, that you will end up across the board generalized with slower data getting to from point A to point B. Is that correct?
Yes. The point I'm making is that if you have to treat every packet equally, that you will end up degrading the average quality of experience across the base of applications. Essentially, prioritization is an extremely powerful tool for network management, and to ban it really undermines the value of these networks moving into the future.
Mr. Wood, what's your response to that?
That my button won't work. I think it's just as where we began, Congressman, that we haven't called for a ban on prioritization done in a neutral fashion to make sure that applications work. We've called for a ban, and the rules had a ban on paid prioritization, meaning that the edge provider, the app maker, whomever we want to
when you have the
think of.
content associated with it. But don't you agree that the FTC already has jurisdiction over that and is able to enforce?
Well, the FTC might have jurisdiction, or DOJ might, if we could make
Well,
it
they
come
either
to
do
the.
or they don't they?
Well, they have jurisdiction over certain kinds of anti-competitive conduct. They don't have jurisdiction if my own home connection is suffering because I can't reach the content that I want. And I'm focused on the internet user, not just this battle between Comcast and Netflix or any other two large providers.
Isn't it in the interest of the company to make sure that the user does have access?
Well, I think what we're talking about today, though, shows that there are use cases for prioritization. So they have general interests in making sure that content is available, but that they might then pick and choose which content is available at which terms for people who pay more.
I had another question. This is tangential. I apologize. But the fake comments, what is your, what is a fake comment?
Well, I think there are different kinds one could describe as less valuable. We certainly think the petition.
Doesn't the FCC able to sift through that and determine what's valuable and what isn't?
Well, I think they said they're not going to decide what is fake and what isn't. So to me, something that is obviously fake or fraudulent is somebody using.
But what's fake?
Somebody using somebody else's identification and name and address to put a comment in.
But the content, isn't it about the content and not who says it?
Well, I do think people have a right to not have things said in their name. So if somebody put a comment in for you supporting Title II, you might care.
People say that. I agree. Fair point. But ultimately, though, the FCC would be looking at the content of the comment, not who said it. Wouldn't that be accurate?
I would hope they would look at the content, but I think it matters who says it too, because people have a right to speak in their own name and not have others speak for them or pretend to speak for them.
But the FCC wouldn't decide something one way or the other just because a specific person said it or didn't say it. Wouldn't that be correct?
That's right, and I think that they still have an obligation to make sure their record isn't tainted by people basically engaging in identity theft in order to make comments that are not actually their own.
Sometimes we probably wish people wouldn't taint our comments too. Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yells back, seeing that there are no further members coming.
Chair,
Yes,
could I
sir.
ask unanimous consent in addition to the letters from pediatricians, telehealth experts, small businesses, and others supporting a ban of paid prioritization. I have one additional letter from the Consumers Union that I'd like to introduce.
Without
into the record.
objection.
Thank you.
Yes, you all have been gracious with your time and with getting your testimony in. Before we conclude, I do want to submit for the record and ask unanimous consent to do so. Tweets of Cloudflare CEO Matthew Prince, a report by Richard Bennett, Designed for Change, a report by BTAG, Daniel Lyons article, your comments, Mr. Reeseve, report by Mr. Reeseve, How Wireless is Different, and an article by George Ford. I will remind our members that pursuant to committee rules, they have 10 days to submit questions in writing to you, and you all will have 10 days in which to respond. There being no further business to come before the committee, we are adjourned.
Apologize. Last week I was out of control. No, don't worry about it. How was going home and the drive and everything? You guys made it there and back in one piece? me after Tuesday.